Story 1. My name is John Harper. I'm a truck driver. At first glance, the job might seem simple. Sit behind the wheel, turn on some music, and hit the road. But it's far from that. Every day is a battle. A battle with fatigue, with bad weather, with clueless drivers who don't understand that a truck is not a car and can't stop on a dime. You have to stay focused every minute, every second. One moment of inattention and you're on the shoulder, or worse, you've crashed into someone. You sit behind the wheel for 10, sometimes even 15 hours a day. Your back aches, your hands go numb, and your eyes water from the strain. But you can't stop. Deadlines don't wait, and the cargo must be delivered on time. One mistake, and you could be in an accident. And an accident in a truck is almost always a catastrophe. And big financial losses. Today I received a new assignment. The cargo needs to be transported through the desert regions of West Virginia. The dispatcher said it was very important, and that the delivery time was limited. I've heard these words hundreds of times, but this time something in his voice was unsettling. He mentioned that the roads there were old and barely passable. I nodded, took the documents, and set off. Work is work. The trip was going to be long, and it started during the day. After filling the tank to the brim, I hit the road. The sun was blazing, the asphalt was melting under the wheels, and it seemed there was no escape from the heat. I always preferred night trips, but this time I had no choice. My thoughts returned to past experiences of driving in these parts. Virginia is not the most pleasant place for a trucker. The roads here are winding, often unpaved, and the navigator doesn't always help. I remember once being stuck here for 3 hours, trying to get out of the mud after a heavy rain. That's when I realized these places could be a real test. Fortunately, nothing unusual happened along the way. I drove hundreds of miles and everything was going according to plan. Cars became scarcer, and soon I found myself in deserted areas. The sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in bloody red and orange hues. The silence around was almost deafening. No sound, no movement. The asphalt under the wheels became uneven, and I slowed down a bit to avoid the jolting. The barely noticeable vibration transmitted through the steering wheel to my hands, intensifying the feeling of fatigue. I felt my eyelids getting heavy, and my thoughts started to blur. And then I saw it. A silhouette hiding in the bushes by the side of the road. Although the sun had not yet set, the light was already dim, but I could make out the creature. It resembled a human, but was covered in thick fur. My heart sank to my feet, and my hands involuntarily gripped the steering wheel tighter. Startled, I braked sharply, and the truck slowed down, almost coming to a stop. The creature didn't move, as if frozen, watching me. My eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a beast, half human, half animal, with eyes glowing in the twilight. Terror gripped me. Cold sweat ran down my back, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We locked eyes for several long seconds before it swiftly disappeared into the tall bushes. I was left alone on the deserted road in silence, only the faint echo of my breathing filling the cabin. What was that? Could it be that fatigue was playing a cruel joke on me? My eyes, tired from the long road, could have deceived me. Trying to calm my shaking hands, I took a deep breath and decided it was just my imagination. It was probably just fatigue combined with the desire to reach my destination. I started the truck again and continued my journey, but a sense of unease remained in my soul. What if it wasn't just a vision? The places became more and more remote and deserted. The road, narrow and unlit, stretched into nowhere. The trees stood so close that their branches almost touched the cabin of my truck. Suddenly, the signal disappeared. My phone showed only one bar of signal before it completely cut off. The navigator froze, no longer updating the route. This was the last thing I needed right now. I was already getting tired, and the thought of having to find my way blindly added to the stress. Everything piled up. First, that monster, then the lost signal, and now this remote area that seemed to be torn from the world and abandoned here, far from civilization. I felt that I could no longer continue in this state. I needed to stop and rest for the night to avoid risking an accident from fatigue. After driving a few more miles, I saw it. A strange house by the side of the road. It stood alone, as if waiting for someone. The house looked old, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows, boarded up in places, seemed like empty eye sockets watching my every move. The roof was covered in moss, and around the house grew thick grass and shrubs, giving the impression that it hadn't been visited in a long time. Despite the abandonment, a light was on in one of the windows. It was strange and a little scary. Was someone living in this house, or was it just a ghost from the past? I slowly drove up to the house and turned off the engine. Silence surrounded me, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Fear and uncertainty crept in. I stood before the strange house, feeling the weight of fatigue and thirst pressing on me. I had run out of drinking water, and I hoped that someone lived in this house and could help me. Approaching the porch, I noticed the steps creaking underfoot, and the veranda itself covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. The weathered walls of the house looked as if they hadn't known fresh paint in years, and the windows were dark, seeming like empty eye sockets watching my every step. I knocked on the door. No response. I knocked again, a little louder. Still silence. I began to think the house was indeed empty, but after several long seconds, the door creaked open, and an old woman appeared on the threshold. She looked worn out, with deep wrinkles cutting through her face like a map of life. Her eyes were cloudy, but still held some spark of life. She wore a simple dress and an old apron. In her hand, she held a kerosene lamp, the light of which cast flickering shadows on her face. "Good evening," I said, trying not to look scared. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm lost, and I've run out of drinking water. Could you help me?" The old woman looked at me carefully, as if evaluating whether she could trust me. Then her face softened and she nodded. "Of course, dear. I'll give you some water and show you the way. Come on in. Don't be shy." She stepped aside, letting me in. I entered, trying not to notice the creaking floorboards underfoot. Inside, the house was as old as the outside. The furniture looked shabby, the walls decorated with faded floral wallpaper. In the corner stood an old fireplace, with embers slowly burning. The air smelled of dust and something else, elusive but unpleasant. "Sit down," said the old woman, pointing to an old wooden chair. "I'll bring you some water." I sat down and looked around. On the shelves were old photographs in frames, books with frayed spines, and numerous trinkets. Everything looked as if time had stopped here decades ago. The old woman returned with a pitcher of water and a glass. She poured the water and handed it to me. "Thank you very much," I said, feeling the thirst begin to subside. "You are very kind. Could you tell me how to get to the nearest town?" She nodded again and began to explain the way, her voice calm and measured. "Drive down this road for about 5 miles, then turn left onto an old dirt road. Another 10 miles and you'll reach the highway. There's a town there." I thanked the old woman for the water and the help, returned to my truck, and continued my journey. As she said, I drove a few miles, but the weather suddenly changed. The sky darkened, a strong wind blew, and soon thunder struck. Heavy rain started turning into a downpour, and I realized the situation was becoming serious. I hoped to make it onto the highway before the weather worsened completely, but my hopes were dashed. The rain was pouring down in sheets, and I was forced to drive slowly, barely making out the road ahead of me. Water lashed against the windows, the headlights barely penetrated the dense curtain of rain, and I had to muster all my skills to stay on the road. Thoughts of stopping and waiting out the storm started to cross my mind when I saw a light in the distance. It was faint but noticeable, piercing through the rain and darkness. Thinking it might be another house or shelter, I headed towards it. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my heart pounded from tension and exhaustion. I slowly approached the light, only to realize something was wrong. The light grew brighter, and suddenly I realized I was back at the same house. To my surprise and alarm, I was standing in front of the same old house where I had recently drunk water and asked the old lady for directions. The wind howled, thunder shattered the silence, and rain drummed on the roof of the truck. This wasn't just strange, it was eerie. How could I end up back here if I had been driving straight, following the old lady's directions? A sense of unease washed over me, making me doubt the reality of what was happening. It seemed as though the house was luring me back, knowing I had nowhere else to go to escape the storm. I sat there, staring at the old house, and suddenly the door opened. The old lady stepped out, holding the kerosene lamp. She noticed me and started waving, inviting me inside. I hesitated, but the storm was intensifying, and common sense told me it was better to seek shelter than stay outside in the pouring rain. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, cursing myself for my cowardice. Grabbing my bag and steeling myself, I dashed to the house, getting soaked to the bone in seconds. The door closed behind me, and I found myself in the corridor. The old lady greeted me with the same kindly smile as before. "Bad weather," she said, shaking her head. "Terrible storm. It's good you're here again." "Yeah, the rain's pouring down and I can hardly see the road," I replied, shaking off the water. "Could I stay here for the night?" "Of course, dear. You can't drive in weather like this. Stay with us and continue your journey in the morning." The old lady gestured invitingly. "Come, I'll show you your room. It's upstairs." I agreed, realizing I had no other choice. The old lady led me through a narrow corridor lit by the dim light of the kerosene lamp. The walls were adorned with old photographs, faded from time, and ancient paintings. Dust and a musty smell lingered in the air, creating the feeling that I had stepped into a house from the last century. We climbed a creaky wooden staircase, and the old lady stopped in front of one of the doors on the second floor. She opened the door and gestured for me to enter. "Here's your room," she said with a smile. "If you need anything else, just let me know." I stepped in and looked around. It was quite cozy, though modest. A small bed with an iron headboard stood against the wall, with a little table and chair beside it. The window, covered with heavy curtains, looked out onto the backyard. An old wardrobe stood in the corner of the room. "Thank you very much," I said, turning to the old lady. "This is much better than being outside in such rain." "I'm just cooking dinner," the old lady said, smiling gently. "You're welcome to join us. The food will be ready soon." I nodded in agreement, and she left, leaving me alone in the room. After unpacking and changing into dry clothes, I felt a sense of relief. I went downstairs and headed for the living room. It was spacious but filled with antique furniture. Bookshelves filled with old volumes lined one wall. On the other hung paintings in heavy wooden frames. A large fireplace with a quietly smoldering fire created a cozy atmosphere despite the storm raging outside. In the middle of the room stood a long wooden table covered with a tablecloth. On the table were simple dishes: soup, stewed meat, bread, and fresh vegetables. My attention was drawn to a figure sitting by the window in a wheelchair. Wrapped in a blanket, with an old hat on their head, the figure sat motionless, staring out the window, paying no attention to me. The old lady entered the living room carrying a tray with hot dishes and set it on the table. "Please have a seat, dear," she said, pointing to an empty seat at the table. "This is my grandson. He can't walk and often sits by the window. Don't mind him. He just likes to watch the outside." I felt a bit nervous, but fatigue and hunger took over. I sat at the table and began to eat, feeling the warm food restoring my strength. The old lady sat across from me, watching attentively as I ate, as if making sure I liked everything. "Thank you for dinner," I said when I was full. "It was very delicious." "I'm glad you liked it," she replied, smiling again. "We don't often have guests, especially in such weather." I nodded, trying not to look at the motionless figure in the wheelchair. The room became cozier, and the warmth of the fireplace relaxed me. But the strange feeling still lingered. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "Please rest, dear. If you need anything, just let me know," the old lady added, standing up from the table. "Good night." But before she left, I decided to ask one more question. "Excuse me, how long have you been living here? What do you do?" The old lady paused, thinking for a moment, and then sat back down at the table, beginning to tell her story. "Oh dear, I've been living here for over 50 years. This house belonged to my husband. We moved here right after our wedding. Back then, this was a thriving place, not a forgotten corner." She sighed, her eyes sparkling with memories. "There used to be a small village nearby. Henry, my husband, worked on the railroad, and I was a school teacher. In those days, being a teacher was important but thankless. Parents were struggling to make ends meet, and children often lacked the necessities. But I loved my job. Seeing children grow, learn, and become individuals meant everything to me." She paused and then continued. "Our 3 children were born in this house. Life was hard but happy. We raised them, worked hard, and took care of our little farm. When the children grew up, they moved to different parts of the country. Our eldest son became a doctor, the middle one an engineer, and our youngest daughter an artist. They rarely visit, but we keep in touch." Her voice wavered slightly, and she fell silent again. "The grandson you saw is my daughter's son. His name is Thomas. A few years ago, he had an accident and is now confined to a wheelchair. I brought him here because it was hard for my daughter to care for him in the city. It's quiet and peaceful here, and it's easier for him." She looked at me and smiled sadly. Gradually, the village started to empty. People left in search of a better life. Shops closed, the school shut down, and soon no one was left. I continued living here, taking care of the house, tending to the farm, and helping Thomas. Now this house is all I have left." Her story was filled with pain, but also warmth. I felt that behind these simple words lay a deep story of love, loss, and survival. "That's an impressive story," I said, feeling genuine respect for this woman. "Thank you for sharing it with me." "Thank you for listening, dear," she replied. "Go to bed. Tomorrow is a new day. I hope the weather improves, and you can continue your journey." I thanked her again and returned to my room, feeling the fatigue finally taking over. Thoughts about the oddities of this house and the old lady's story swirled in my head, but I decided that everything would become clearer in the morning. For now, I could only lie down and hope that the night would pass peacefully. I was woken up by a noise downstairs. The room was pitch dark, and the light was off. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight to illuminate the way. My heart pounded in my chest, and adrenaline kept me on edge. Slowly and carefully, I went down the creaky stairs, trying not to make a sound. I called out to the old lady, but no one answered. The silence was oppressive, and I decided to inspect the house to understand what was happening. Entering the living room, I saw that the figure by the window was still sitting motionless, just as before. It was the same grandson in the wheelchair staring out the window. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of unease. Something about this scene was unnatural. When I got closer, the flashlight illuminated the figure's face, and horror washed over me. Sitting in the chair was not a living soul, but a life-sized wooden doll. Its glass eyes stared straight ahead, and its mouth was slightly open, creating a ghastly impression. I recoiled, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just eerie, it was revolting. My hand trembled, and the flashlight beam darted around, illuminating other corners of the room that now seemed even more sinister. Trying to calm myself, I took a deep breath and looked around. Thoughts raced through my mind. Why had the old lady lied? What kind of macabre game was being played here? My instincts screamed at me to run, but I decided to investigate. I called out to the old lady again, but still no answer. I continued my inspection of the house, trying not to miss any details. Opening the door to the kitchen, I entered and shone the flashlight around. The kitchen was old-fashioned, with wooden cabinets and tables covered with faded tablecloths. On the shelves stood old pots and pans, and in the corner was a stove, with a fire still flickering. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and stale food. As I looked around, my eyes caught sight of a small door in the floor, leading to the basement. My heart pounded faster, and I decided to check what was down there. Opening the door, I saw steep wooden steps leading down. The flashlight illuminated the way, and I cautiously began to descend. The air in the basement was damp and cold, and the smell grew increasingly unpleasant. At the bottom, I saw shelves lined with jars of preserves and other canned goods. The walls were lined with brick, and the floor was covered with old wooden planks. But when I looked closely, my heart froze in my chest. In the far corner of the basement stood large glass tanks filled with murky liquid. I approached to see what was inside and nearly fainted. Floating inside were human limbs, arms, legs, heads. The sight was horrifying and unnatural. Terror gripped me, and I was about to run when I heard a faint sound. I shone the flashlight towards the noise and saw a bound girl in the corner. She was unconscious and mumbling something. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her clothes torn. I couldn't leave her there. I quickly ran over and began untying the ropes that bound her hands and feet. The girl's skin was cold to the touch, and I realized she urgently needed help. "Hold on," I whispered, trying not to make any noise. "I'm getting you out of here." Lifting her in my arms, I slowly and cautiously carried her upstairs, constantly looking around, fearing an attack. The storm outside was still raging, but I knew we couldn't stay here any longer. When we reached the truck, I gently placed the girl on the back seat and quickly got behind the wheel. Starting the engine, I glanced back at the house, feeling fear and adrenaline surge through me. That creepy house and its dreadful secrets were behind us, and ahead lay only the road and a hope for salvation. I drove onto the highway, praying the engine wouldn't fail me now. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I sped away from that horrible place, not looking back. We drove down the highway, and the girl was still unconscious. She was muttering something, her face pale and her breathing weak. The bad weather persisted, and visibility was poor. Rain poured down in torrents, the wipers barely keeping up with the deluge, and the wind buffeted the truck. But I kept driving, not slowing down, trying to reach a safe place as quickly as possible. After several miles, I suddenly noticed a light ahead. As I got closer, my heart clenched in terror. It was the same house we had just left. Something inside me twisted with fear. Was this happening again? How was this possible? I slowly approached the house, and dread gripped me as I realized it was indeed the same house. Its familiar outline and windows with dim light induced a panic. I didn't stop, and turning around, drove forward, hoping to escape this nightmare. But after driving a few more miles, the house reappeared in front of me. I felt cold sweat trickle down my back, and panic began to take over. Something was wrong with this place. Terribly wrong. It felt like we were trapped with no way out. I continued driving forward, but each time after a few miles I saw the same house in front of me. It repeated over and over. Each time I saw it, my fear intensified. The girl on the back seat still mumbled something unconsciously, and I felt helpless in the face of this horror. Suddenly she began to come to. Her eyes slowly opened, and she tried to focus her gaze. She was disoriented and weak, but gradually started to realize her surroundings. "Water, please," she whispered, struggling to form words. I quickly grabbed a bottle of water and handed it to her. She took a few greedy sips, then began to cry, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Where am I? What's happening?" she asked, trembling from fear and weakness. "You're safe. I found you in the basement of a house," I began, trying to speak calmly. "I was driving down the road when I stumbled upon this house. I met an old lady who offered shelter. Then I heard a noise in the basement and found you there, tied up." She looked at me with horror and despair in her eyes, then noticed that we were approaching the same house again. "It's useless," she whispered, looking at the house that had reappeared before us. "We can't get away from here." She sighed, and gathering her thoughts began to tell her story. "My name is Lisa. My friends and I were on a trip. We were having fun, and nothing foretold trouble. We accidentally came across this house and decided to stop to ask for directions and rest a bit. The old lady seemed friendly, and she invited us to dinner. We agreed because it was late, and we were tired." She paused, her voice trembling. "After dinner, the nightmare began. We tried to leave, but every time, just like now, we returned to this house. It felt like we were trapped. Then the hunt began. At night, some creature like a giant wolf or dog attacked us. We tried to run, but our chances were slim. We ran out of gas and had to hide in the forest." Her eyes filled with tears, and she continued, "Almost everyone was killed. We were panicked, helpless, and cornered. I was captured and locked in the basement. I thought I would die there, with no chance of rescue." A chill ran down my spine. The creature I had seen earlier now had context, and terror gripped me anew. We drove up to the same house again. My skin prickled as I remembered what was stored in the basement. Those horrible glass jars with human limbs filled me with new fear. But we couldn't just sit idly by. We had to do something. Why couldn't we escape? Maybe it was black magic or something else. I was ready to believe anything. But if we didn't figure this out, we would die. "We need to explore the house again," I said, trying to sound firm. "Maybe we missed something. There might be a way out." Lisa nodded, her face full of determination despite the fear. We got out of the truck, moving quietly and carefully. The rain was still pouring, and the wind howled as if the house itself was calling us back. We approached the door and, trying not to make any noise, carefully opened it. The house greeted us with an eerie silence. We stepped inside and began to explore. I held the flashlight in one hand and Lisa walked beside me, inspecting every detail. We started with the living room. My flashlight illuminated the books on the shelves, old paintings, and the fireplace where the fire was dying out. Nothing new. Then we moved to the kitchen, which looked exactly as I remembered. Wooden cabinets, a table covered with a faded tablecloth, and an old stove. "We need to check the basement again," I whispered, feeling a chill of fear down my spine. Lisa nodded, and we headed to the small door in the floor. I opened it and shone the light down, illuminating the steep steps. We began to descend, and the air grew damper and colder. In the basement, the jars of preserves and canned goods stood as before, but my eyes were drawn to the glass tanks. I felt the same horror as the first time. Lisa froze when she saw the grotesque sight. "What a nightmare," she whispered, her voice trembling. We continued to explore the basement, trying not to miss any details. Carefully inspecting the walls, we stumbled upon a small hole hidden behind a shelf of jars. I shone the flashlight on it, and we saw that it was a narrow passage leading somewhere further. "Look, Lisa, there's some kind of passage here," I said, surprised by the discovery. "Could this be the way out?" she suggested, her voice trembling with hope. We decided to check it out. Moving the shelf aside, we began to crawl through the hole. The passage was narrow and damp, the walls pressing against our shoulders, but we moved forward feeling the air become fresher. We crawled slowly and cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like an eternity, we emerged outside, finding ourselves in the middle of thick bushes. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed like a lesser problem. I stood up, looking around, and noticed that the house was still nearby. Behind it, there was a small shed from which strange sounds were emanating. "We need to check that shed," I said, feeling fear fill me again. We cautiously approached the shed, trying not to attract attention. As we got closer, we peered inside through a small gap in the wall. The sight that greeted us was eerie and strange. In a small chair sat the old lady. She was humming something, her voice quiet and monotonous. On her lap lay a creature that looked like a cross between a human and a wolf or dog. Its body was covered in thick fur, and a long tail was visible on its back. The creature wagged its tail contentedly, listening to the old lady's humming. "That's the creature I saw earlier," I whispered, feeling my heart clench with fear. Lisa pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with horror. "What is she doing?" she asked in a whisper. "It seems like she's somehow connected to that creature," I replied, trying to understand what was happening. We stood there, watching the old lady and the strange creature, when suddenly the creature lifted its nose and started sniffing, as if it had caught a scent. Its sharp ears perked up, and it quickly turned its head in our direction. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we had been discovered. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Lisa's hand. We bolted away from the shed, heading towards the forest. The rain lashed our faces. The ground beneath our feet was slippery, but adrenaline drove us forward. We ran, not looking back, hearing the heavy steps and growls of the creature behind us. The forest seemed endless, trees flashing past our eyes, and I felt my strength waning. The creature was closing in on us, its steps growing louder and closer. We glanced back and saw it was right behind us. "Faster!" I yelled, trying to give Lisa more strength. Suddenly, the creature leapt at us, and I realized we couldn't outrun it. Grabbing a sturdy branch from the ground, I struck it with all my might. The beast snarled and recoiled, but only for a moment. It lunged again, and I hit it once more, aiming for its face. The creature staggered, and we used the moment to keep running. "Come on, Lisa, we have to get out!" I shouted, feeling my strength fading. We kept running, our legs barely moving from exhaustion, but fear pushed us on. The forest grew denser, but I hoped it would help us hide. We heard the creature still chasing us, its breath heavy and menacing. Finally, after a long and exhausting run, we burst into a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. But what we saw made our hearts stop. We were back at the same house. "No," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with despair. I felt a tight knot of fear inside me. We had run for so long, only to end up back at the start. I didn't know what to do next, and panic began to overtake me. We heard the creature approaching again. Its heavy breathing and menacing growls grew louder. We couldn't stay put. We had to run. "To the house!" I yelled, grabbing Lisa's hand. We dashed towards the house. On the porch, we were met with a horrifying sight. The old lady sat in a rocking chair, her face twisted into a mad grin. She held a plate of nuts and laughed loudly as if watching a show. "Well, did you meet my grandson? I hope you liked him," she screeched, her voice like metal scraping on glass. It was a terrifying sight. The kind old lady was gone. Before us was some mad creature. We stared at her in horror, but knew we had to act quickly. Deciding that the house might offer some shelter, we dashed inside and locked the door behind us. The creature slammed into the door, causing it to shudder, but it held firm. Then everything went silent, a sinister quietness settling over the house. We walked around, listening to every sound, and heard scratching at the walls. The creature hadn't left. It was still hunting us. We went into the living room, and suddenly there was complete silence. It was strange, as if the world was holding its breath. Suddenly, the creature leapt out from under the table and attacked me. Its fangs gleamed in the flashlight's beam, and it knocked me to the ground. I managed to grab a nearby chair and used it to hold the creature at bay while lying on my back. It tried to bite me, growling and writhing, its claws scraping against the chair, trying to reach me. I felt its hot breath and saw the fury in its eyes. My strength was fading, but I kept fighting, struggling to keep it at bay. At that moment, I looked up at the ceiling and saw a strange pentagram. It was intricate and eerily beautiful, its lines glowing with a sinister light. I realized it wasn't just a drawing. It might be the source of the power trapping us here. Lisa grabbed a chair and struck the creature with all her might. The creature was thrown to the side, and with great effort I managed to get up. My eyes fell on a kerosene lamp on the table. Without hesitation, I grabbed it and threw it at the creature. The lamp shattered, spilling kerosene everywhere, soaking the floor and the creature. Grabbing a candle, I tossed it into the pool of kerosene. Flames erupted suddenly, quickly spreading to the curtains. The creature howled in pain, its body engulfed in flames. We heard the old woman scream, a sound full of rage and horror. "Run!" I shouted, and we dashed for the exit. Running out of the house, we saw the old woman rise from her chair and come towards us. Her face was twisted with anger. "What have you done to my grandson?" she screamed, heading back into the house. We didn't answer and instead ran to the truck. The flames spread surprisingly fast, thick smoke pouring from the windows, and fire bursting out. The howls and cries of the old woman mixed into a terrifying chorus. I didn't look back to see what would happen next. Turning the ignition, I hit the gas and we sped away. In the distance, the house burned brightly, and we prayed we wouldn't be drawn back there. Soon we made it onto the highway, and I realized we had escaped. As soon as we got a signal, we called the police. I don't know what happened next, because after I left Lisa and gave my statement, I drove away. I tried to forget everything that happened that horrible night. The images and sounds haunted me for a long time, but I knew one thing. We survived. Story 2. My advice to you is always to choose a safe route, even if you're just going to the nearest store or pharmacy. Unfortunately, I chose a dangerous path and barely escaped with my life. This happened last month, and I still don't know what happened to me or how I survived. It all started with an invitation. A colleague invited me to spend the weekend at his country house. It was far from the city, and the road to it was unfamiliar to me. My colleague assured me that getting there was easy and wouldn't take much effort. At first glance, the route did seem simple. Get on the 75th highway, turn left after a few miles at the 2 hills, and then go straight to the end. I left the city late in the evening and unexpectedly found myself in heavy rain, a hurricane, and a thunderstorm, even though the weather forecast had promised a clear and sunny day. It happens. Everyone can be wrong, I thought, crossing those hills. Visibility on the road was terrible, so I drove slowly. Getting into an accident was not part of my plan. After 2 hours of slow driving, I saw a fallen tree on the road. Another obstacle. I had to detour, and how lucky that there was a turn onto another road right in front of the tree. There were no lights, and the road seemed very old. It was clear that cars rarely passed through it. Part of the road was washed out by water, making it difficult to drive. I was seriously worried about getting stuck in the mud. In the distance, I started to see rooftops. It was already past midnight, and the rain only intensified. Continuing the journey in such weather was impossible, so I decided to call my colleague and inform him that I would arrive in the morning and spend the night in this small town. To my surprise, there was no signal on my phone. I had no choice but to find a motel and call from there. I noticed that this small town literally consisted of one road, along which various buildings and houses were located. Many of them were very old and seemed empty and uninhabited. The entire town was incredibly quiet and gloomy. If it weren't for the lights in the windows, I would have thought it was abandoned. Looking for a motel, I stopped at one house to ask the residents. At that moment, a flash of lightning lit up the road, and I saw a silhouette. It was a tall, pale man with a very long neck and arms, dressed in rags. He quickly jumped back and ran towards the house. All this happened in a split second, and I was a little shocked, but I pulled myself together. I decided that due to poor visibility and fatigue, I saw this person slightly distorted. I drove as close to the house as possible, where I thought the man had gone, and hiding from the rain, quickly ran under the porch. I knocked politely several times and loudly called for the owner, but no one answered. This was strange since the house had lights on. I also saw shadows in the windows and heard footsteps behind the door. The rain was pouring down like a bucket, and I couldn't bear it anymore, so I decided to enter the house without an invitation. I opened the door and went inside. The house was dimly lit and smelled of dampness, mold, and wet earth. I called for the owner again, but there was no answer. I decided to go deeper into the house, bypassing the living room, and ended up in the kitchen. Here it was even darker, with only one lamp on. The atmosphere was very dirty and unpleasant. I noticed a pile of dirty dishes and unfinished food on the table, with cockroaches and ants crawling everywhere. A flash of lightning illuminated the backyard of the house, which was covered with tombstones. It looked like a cemetery. Wait, it really was a cemetery. A chill ran down my spine, but what could I do next? I decided to bypass the house and return to the car. The floor creaked loudly under my feet, and I ended up in a small room that, like the kitchen, was in terrible condition. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls, the ceiling was full of leaks, and the floor was smeared with dried mud. I didn't dare go up to the second floor, and deciding that I'd had enough, I began to leave the house. Passing by a door leading to the basement, I heard a noise and stopped, Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. I was scared but didn't run away. After thinking for a moment, I decided to see who was making the noise in the basement. As soon as I bent down, something pushed me from behind and I flew down. It hurt, but I pulled myself together and began to look around. The basement smelled strongly of rot. It was almost impossible to breathe. Turning on the flashlight on my phone, I was horrified. I saw something I will never forget, and my blood still runs cold. I saw bones. The entire basement was filled with human bones. But the most terrifying thing was that in the shadows I noticed that same silhouette. A man with long arms. He had a pale, smooth head of unnatural shape, small black eyes, a large, strong jaw, and sharp teeth. This creature was gnawing on something, making disgusting sounds. He suddenly stopped and looked at me, slowly rising. He was over 2 meters tall. I didn't wait for this monster to attack me. I quickly jumped up and ran up the stairs. Behind me, I heard a piercing roar, and when I was already at the front door, he grabbed my leg. I turned around and hit him with a chair I managed to grab. He let go, and I ran outside. The rain had already stopped, and fog covered the ground. Getting into the car, I immediately pulled the handbrake and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw only the old cemetery. No houses, no buildings, just tombstones and these monsters. Tall creatures in rags, silently watching as I moved further and further away. In the morning, I finally reached my colleague's country house. He was shocked to see me. I was all dirty, tired, and with panic in my eyes. I couldn't utter a word. Later, I came to my senses and told him what had happened to me. My colleague said that beyond the 2 hills, there was no small town, only an old cemetery that had long been closed. But according to an old legend, there used to be a small town that burned down with all its inhabitants several centuries ago. Of course, after such a story, I returned by another road and never accepted invitations from this colleague again. Story 3. I am a fool. I did not appreciate what I had. I didn't value my life, neglected my friends and relatives, and the people who sought to help and support me. I was hasty to escape it all. I muttered, my voice blending into the heavy silence that hung over the room. The gloom swallowed the words as soon as they left my lips. Resting my forehead against the cool, damp wall, I let the cold seep into my skin. The monotony of my past life, the repetitiveness of work and return home day in and day out, seemed far away now. It gnawed at me then, a constant rat of dissatisfaction chewing through my sanity. I felt destined for more, for something special, something out of the ordinary. Be careful what you wish for. Right now, I wasn't sure if I'd even live to see the morning. I've locked myself in this room, shrouded in a darkness so thick it feels palpable, almost solid. No one could enter this room but me. My plan was to be safe, but it turned out differently. My breathing became heavy and irregular with fear, and in the darkness, I felt someone else breathing beside me. In that oppressive darkness, someone was breathing heavily and coming toward me. And then I heard her whisper, "What a lovely night." A woman's voice, clear as a bell, eerie in the quiet. My blood turned to ice. My heart pounded against my rib cage like a desperate bird trying to escape a cage. My hand scrambled for the doorknob, and I shot out of the room, out of there, into the night, into the unknown. A year ago, I wouldn't have been in this godforsaken place. A year ago, I was just Tom. Tom with a wife, a mortgage, a secure job, and a life as mundane as it was comforting. But then the divorce happened. It rattled me, shook me to the core. I looked at my life and realized I was unhappy, so I decided to change it. I threw caution to the wind, quit my job, sold my house. I bought a motorhome, a cozy little thing that promised freedom and adventure. My golden retriever, Bucky, was the only piece of my old life I brought along. He was my companion, my friend, my anchor in the storm of change. For over a year, we traveled from the vast plains of Texas to the towering mountains of Colorado, from the sun-kissed beaches of California to the bustling streets of New York. Every new place brought new acquaintances, new experiences, and a chance to earn a little money. I found odd jobs wherever I went, relying on my charisma and easygoing nature. I loved it, loved the novelty, the freedom. I lived for the unexpected, for the thrill of waking up to a different view outside my window every morning, the wind in my hair, Bucky's excited barks echoing around us as we hit the open road. For a while, it was everything I wanted, everything I thought I was missing. The sun was inching towards the horizon when Bucky and I rolled into a small town nestled at the edge of a picturesque forest. It was a place forgotten by time, where the charm of yesteryears still lingered on the peeling paint of the houses and the cobbled streets. My motorhome rumbled into an old gas station, a relic from a bygone era. The building stood there like a lonely sentinel, aged and worn down, seemingly abandoned. But a sign on the door caught my attention. Night shift worker needed. The salary listed was good, better than any odd job I had taken up till now. It was the perfect opportunity to bolster my dwindling budget. An old man emerged from the building, leaning heavily on a cane. His long, thick beard was streaked with silver, a stark contrast against his dark, wrinkled skin. He was very tall, nearly scraping the doorframe as he stepped out, but painfully thin, his old, shabby clothes hanging off his bony frame. He looked stern, almost grim, his eyes guarded. This was Theodore, the owner of the gas station. Our conversation was brief. He introduced himself, outlined my duties, and without further ado accepted me for the job. He didn't ask anything about me, where I came from, why I was here. It was odd, but I shrugged it off. On the road, I had encountered all kinds of people. Theodore was strange, no doubt, but not the strangest. With my new job secured, I decided to take a walk through the sleepy town. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. The buildings lining the streets were old, quaint, their architectural details hinting at the town's age. There was an unusual calmness. Most people were either at work or confined to their homes. I crossed paths with only a handful of locals. I nodded in greeting, and they returned it with cautious smiles. There were only 2 grocery stores, a testament to the town's slow pace and limited needs. It felt like a bubble, untouched by the rapid evolution of the outside world. Time seemed to have slowed down here, suspended in a gentle sway of nostalgia and tranquility. It was calming, appealing in a way the constant change of the road wasn't. For a man on a journey, a man of movement, the allure of such profound stillness was strange but undeniable. I decided to stay for a few days, soak in the serenity, and replenish my funds. As darkness fell on my first night at the old gas station, I felt an eerie tranquility enveloping me. Bucky sat by my side, his eyes reflecting the glow of the dim gas station lights. We were isolated on the old road with the vast black forest around us. The first hours were uneventful. I went about my duties, cleaning, tending to the pumps, inventorying the sparse merchandise on the shelves. As the hours passed, a feeling of unease began to creep in. The gas station, a charming relic during the day, took on a different aura in the night. The shadows played tricks on the corners of my eyes. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified, and every creak of the old building felt like a whisper in the wind. But Bucky was by my side, and his calm presence was comforting. Despite the odd vibes, I brushed it off as first-night jitters. It was past midnight when I saw the lights of a car approaching. An old model, its bodywork reflecting the stories of its years. A man stepped out, dressed in a long coat and a plaid hat shadowing his features. He filled up his car with practiced ease, then walked towards the counter. "Good evening," he greeted, a small smile playing on his lips. His voice was deep and resonant, the timbre of it oddly calming. "Cold today, isn't it?" he said, filling the silent night with his voice. We got talking then, about the weather, about cars, about the landscape around us. He introduced himself as Edward. Edward was a seasoned traveler, a man who had seen the world. His stories were fascinating, his words painting vivid pictures in my mind. He spoke of his travels, how he had journeyed on this road many years ago, how much it had changed, yet how much had stayed the same. His stories were woven with a love for the area, and I found myself drawn into his tales. Throughout our conversation, Bucky behaved peculiarly. He growled when Edward first approached, then retreated behind the counter, whimpering softly. It was unlike Bucky to behave this way, but Edward didn't seem to notice, and Bucky's unease didn't escalate. I dismissed it as my faithful companion being wary of a stranger. As the night grew deeper, Edward left, his old car disappearing down the road. The rest of the night was quiet. The only customers were the stars above and the whispers of the wind. With the first rays of dawn, Theodore arrived. I handed over the night's earnings, a sense of accomplishment filling me. Despite the oddities of the night, it had been a good first shift. The next 2 nights were uneventful. Edward, the lonely night traveler, was my sole patron. His visits were like clockwork, midnight on the dot. Bucky's behavior, however, grew stranger by the hour. He'd whine at the sight of Edward disappearing behind the counter and sometimes refusing to leave the motorhome entirely. He was especially unsettled around Theodore. Their indifference to Bucky was odd. They seemed oblivious to him, not even acknowledging his presence. I tried to reassure Bucky, comfort him, but nothing seemed to work. On the 3rd night, I decided to leave Bucky behind. He whimpered and nipped at my trouser leg as I readied myself for my shift, his eyes full of a fear I couldn't fathom. It was heartbreaking to see, but I felt it best to leave him behind. The night was eerily quiet as I settled in. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional chirp of a cricket outside, they filled the silence, the mundane sounds of an average night. I was in the middle of my cleaning routine when I heard the rumble of a car engine. A vintage pink convertible pulled up, its polished surface glistening under the gas station lights. A woman stepped out, her dress a retro 50s style, her hair coiffed to perfection. She approached the counter with a disarming smile, asking for directions and petrol. As I filled her car, we exchanged small talk. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, an unsettling feeling I couldn't place. Her smile, her laughter, it was oddly familiar. Her invitation to join her on her journey caught me off guard. I declined politely, but her smile never wavered. She left as abruptly as she'd come, her departure leaving an inexplicable void in her wake. The 4th night brought another visitor. Her young face contrasted against her old-fashioned dress. Her eyes held an ineffable longing. She too needed fuel, but there was more to her than a mere need for gasoline. As we conversed, her story unfolded. She had lost her love on this very road in a devastating car accident. She was searching for him, her words filled with the desperation that made my heart ache. She claimed that he often drove past the gas station at night, Others had seen him, but she was always a moment too late. Her tale, though tragic, seemed improbable. Her state of mind seemed shaky, her loss rendering her a bit delusional. After filling her car, she smiled a sorrowful smile, her eyes glazed over with unshed tears. She drove away, leaving me standing there, her story resonating in the silence of the night. A peculiar pattern began to emerge over the next few nights. An increasing number of my customers seemed trapped in a time warp, their outfits reminiscent of bygone eras, their cars vintage models like they had driven straight out of an old photograph. Their interactions were a mixture of mundane and surreal. Some were tight-lipped, their conversations limited to perfunctory exchanges, while others shared anecdotes that made my skin crawl. Stories of missed opportunities, lost time, unfinished goodbyes to their loved ones. I distinctly remember one woman. She was wearing an expensive dress. Her car was an expensive model, luxurious in every sense of the word. Her hands trembled as she recounted her tale. Her family, she claimed, had conspired against her, staging a car accident in a Parisian tunnel to end her life. The fear in her eyes was tangible, her story so wild I was left questioning the line between reality and hallucination. The inexplicability of the events was starting to gnaw at my nerves. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, escape from the enigmatic occurrences plaguing the sleepy town. However, the lure of the generous salary kept me anchored. I reasoned with myself. Sure, these customers are odd, but I'm safe, aren't I? And so I decided to continue my stint at the gas station. Amidst all the chaos, there was one constant: Edward. Like clockwork, he'd pull up in his old car, fill his tank, converse amiably, and leave. The rhythm of his visits was almost comforting, a predictable pattern in the maelstrom of the bazaar. But that night, Edward didn't come. An unspoken worry started to gnaw at me. His absence felt significant, an ominous shift in the pattern I'd grown accustomed to. Impulsively, I decided to leave the store and walk down the road, hoping to spot Edward's car approaching. That's when I heard it, a man's voice from behind, as clear as day. "Hey boy, I see you're a real gentleman. Good people like you don't stay long in places like this." The unexpected voice made me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding, but I found no one. For a moment, I thought it was Edward. The voice held the same timbre, the same casual tone, but the emptiness around me made me question my senses. The next evening, a thick fog drifted over the town and the gas station, enveloping them in a dense, wet blanket. As I stood near one of the gas pumps, a woman's voice punctured the silence. "Excuse me, could you check the tire pressure?" I turned sharply, but the fog held its secrets well. There was no woman, no car, just the thick mist slowly swirling around me. A chill spread through my body. The fear was no longer just lurking in the shadows. It was confronting me head-on. Seeing no one around, I decided to retreat into the relative safety of the store. As I turned to leave, a sound pierced the quiet. The unmistakable hum of a car engine. It pulled into the gas station, the grind of the tires, the click of doors opening and closing. There was laughter, a murmur of conversation, a tableau of normality painted in sound. Yet when I looked around, I was alone. The gas station was deserted, a stage with no actors. The fear seized me, propelling me towards the store. I raced inside, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding as the locks clicked into place. I was terrified, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Was I hallucinating? Was it the gasoline fumes playing tricks on my mind, or was sleep deprivation finally catching up with me? The unease deepened, wrapping its icy tendrils around my heart. I decided to close the shop and gas station. I needed to get away. As I picked up the keys from the counter, I turned back towards the door and froze. Outside, through the fog-smudged glass, stood a guy. He was in a black leather jacket, his skin pale and stretched taut over his slender frame. His eyes were the most chilling, lifeless, and glassy, straight out of a horror movie. "Full tank, please," he said, his voice a chilling echo in the silence. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands shook as I slipped the key into the door, ready to close up. "What are you doing, Tom?" he asked, his words like ice on my spine. He knew my name. I'd never seen him before, yet he knew me. As I locked the door, my gaze drifted beyond him into the fog. The gray was dotted with shadows, shapes of vintage cars and specters of people. They stood silently, watching the store, watching me. Then came a rustle behind me. I turned around, my heart in my throat, to see a young boy standing there with bags of salted nuts. He grinned, his eyes dancing with mischief. He began to speak, but the words were foreign, unintelligible. The fear swallowed me, pushing me to bolt towards the back room. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as I fought to catch my breath. My heart pounded in my ears as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. I was caught in a nightmare I didn't understand, and I had no idea how to escape. Shut inside the room, I locked the padlock, the click echoing in the silent space. The only sound for miles, it seemed, was the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe, that the solid door could keep out the strange happenings beyond it. But even as I tried to slow my erratic breathing, the air around me became heavy with the unmistakable sound of someone else's breath. In the darkness, I could hear the labored breathing of another, drawing closer with each moment. An icy shiver crept down my spine, my heart rate increasing in the suffocating silence. Suddenly, the whispering voice broke through the quiet. "Lovely night." Turning around, my eyes barely made out a figure. The woman with sad eyes who had been visiting the gas station. She was looking for her lost love, the one claimed by a deadly car accident. The realization sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, prompting me to leap to my feet. My legs carried me towards the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Bursting out of the room, I found myself face to face with the familiar sight of Edward's car. The sound of its honking horn was like a life raft to a drowning man. Edward was in the car, the window rolled down as he urgently beckoned. "Tom, hurry up! Get in! Don't waste time!" Relief washed over me like a tidal wave, and I found myself running to the car. The door opened with a familiar creak, and I clambered into the vehicle. The moment I was in, Edward pressed down on the gas, the station retreating into the fog as we sped away. Gratitude bubbled within me, and I found myself thanking Edward profusely. Edward glanced at me, his face grim in the dim light. "You're a good guy, Tom, but you shouldn't have worked at that gas station. Get in your RV and drive away before they know where you're staying." His words echoed in the tight space of the car, wrapping around me like a chilling prophecy. But who are all these people, Edward? Why are they so scary? Edward, who are you really? I found myself blurting out, desperate for answers to the riddles that had been plaguing me. Edward, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead. The journey to the camper felt much shorter than it should have. As I climbed out of Edward's car, he simply gave me a solemn wave before driving off, his car disappearing into the thick fog that seemed to have grown denser with the break of dawn. I stood staring at the camper door that lay just a few steps away. Bucky's anxious barking pierced through the stillness, a desperate call of urgency. My hand was on the door handle, about to push it open, when Bucky dashed out. He growled low, barking loudly at the surrounding fog before he darted away, disappearing into the shrouded unknown. "Bucky!" I called out, my voice strained. The cold mist swallowed the echoes of my cry, returning only a haunting silence. As I strained my eyes through the dense fog, I began to discern looming figures slowly emerging from the misty veil. Their silhouettes grew increasingly distinct as they steadily advanced. They were the people from the gas station, the strange apparitions that had inexplicably marked my existence these past few days. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them draw closer. In the face of the unknown, and with Bucky lost in the fog, my instincts screamed at me to heed Edward's advice. I forced my feet to move, carrying me back towards the safety of my RV. The familiar metal under my hands was a grounding force as I clambered into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, pulling away from the enveloping strangeness of the town. Fear was my guide now, a relentless motivator urging me further away from the spectral gas station and its enigmatic customers. My journey continued until I was finally free from the confining fog and found myself on a main road, the forest road now a distant memory in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until I reached the safety of another small town that I allowed myself to breathe again. In this relatively busy township, I was horrified to learn that the old forest road had long since been erased from maps. Even more chilling was the revelation that the sleepy town, the place I had just escaped from, had burned to the ground decades ago, its inhabitants lost to the merciless flames, and the gas station, the eerie hub of my inexplicable encounters, was unheard of too.